She challenged human to deathmatch, lost virginity instead of her life. The roar of the Xylos crowd was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that beat against the energy shields of the grand arena. It was a sound of bloodlust and expectation, and it was all for her. Jyra stood on the searing white sands, the twin suns of her world glinting off the polished gold of her armor. Her fiery red hair was braided back tightly, and her sharp, pointed ears twitched, catching every nuance of the crowd's fervor. She was the Sword of House Kor, a warrior maiden of impeccable lineage, and today she had to prove it. Before her, awaiting the start of their deathmatch, stood the human, Jesse. He was a curious creature, captured in a border skirmish, larger than most of the males of her species, and built with a rugged, dense power that was plain to see even in his simple prisoner's fatigues. His sandy brown hair was cropped short, his jaw strong and set. He met her gaze not with the terror she expected, but with a disconcerting calm. Her rival, Vorlag, watched from the High Council dais, his dark blue skin a stark contrast to the white marble. His smirk was a challenge in itself, a physical manifestation of the whispers that had followed her for weeks. Too compassionate, too reliant on strategy over strength. Soft. Today, she would silence those whispers in a torrent of human blood. The matriarch, her face a web of ancient wrinkles, raised a hand. The arena fell silent. "Let honor be judged," the matriarch's voice boomed, amplified through the arena. Jyra didn't hesitate. She launched herself forward, her movements a blur of practiced, lethal grace. The Xylos way of combat was a dance of overwhelming force, of precise, powerful strikes meant to shatter an opponent's guard and their will. Her plasma glaive hummed, leaving a trail of shimmering heat in the air. The human didn't try to meet her blow for blow. Instead, he moved. He sidestepped, he pivoted, he used the space of the arena in a way no Xylos warrior ever would. Her powerful lunges met empty air. His defense was frustratingly efficient, a series of deflections and parries that expended the minimum amount of energy. He was weathering her storm, and the crowd's roar began to curdle with confusion. She pressed her attack, forcing him back, the hum of her glaive a constant threat. He was strong. She felt it in the jarring impact every time his simple metal staff met her blade. But he was also patient, his steady eyes tracking her every move, analyzing, learning. It was unnerving. Xylos warriors fought with passion and fury. This human fought with a cold, unnerving focus. She feinted left, then brought her glaive around in a sweeping arc meant to cleave him in two. It was a classic, unstoppable maneuver, and he fell for it. He raised his staff to block, a futile gesture against the energized blade. A roar of triumph began to build in Jyra's chest, but at the last possible second, he dropped, the sand exploding around him as he kicked out, not at her, but at the ground beneath her feet. The sand gave way, disrupting her footing for a fraction of a second. It was all he needed. He twisted, his staff hooking her ankle, and pulled. Her balance, so perfect and ingrained through a lifetime of training, was shattered. Jyra hit the sand hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. Before she could recover, he was on her, a knee pinning her chest, the tip of his simple metal staff pressed against the soft flesh of her throat. The entire arena, the entire world, fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence. The shame was a physical fire, hotter than the twin suns overhead. Jyra, Sword of House Kor, knelt on the arena floor, defeated. Not by a champion, but by a captured human savage with a simple metal stick. She could feel Vorlag's smug gaze from the dais, his political victory complete. She closed her eyes, waiting for the final blow. Death was the price of failure. It was the law. The Xylos matriarch, her voice heavy with ceremony, began the rite of judgment. The challenger has been bested. By the ancient laws, her life is forfeit. Jesse remained over her, his breathing steady, the staff unmoving at her throat. He looked from her to the matriarch, then to the silent, off-world delegation that observed from a shielded balcony. A human ambassador, a stern-faced woman, made a subtle gesture, a slight nod of her head. The matriarch's voice lowered. "Victor, what say you? Will you claim your honor in blood?" Jesse did not move his staff, but his voice was clear and carried in the unnatural quiet. "There is another law, is there not?" A murmur of confusion rippled through the stands. The matriarch's ancient yellow eyes narrowed. "Speak plainly, human." "The law of conquest," Jesse said, his voice steady. The victor can claim the defeated, servitude instead of death. Jaira's eyes snapped open. No, not that. Anything but that. Death was honor. The conqueror's servitude was the ultimate humiliation, a fate reserved for the most despised enemies. To be made a slave, a bedservant, to the one who defeated you, it was a stripping of all identity, a complete and utter breaking of the spirit. The crowd, silent a moment before, erupted in a howl of outrage. They were not screaming for her death anymore. They were screaming in disgust at the human's audacity, at the insult. Vorlag was on his feet, his face a mask of theatrical fury, but Jaira could see the triumph in his eyes. This was better than her death. This was her complete and total ruin. "You would invoke this archaic custom?" the matriarch asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "You would shame this warrior so?" "I would spare her life," Jesse corrected, his gaze unwavering. "I claim her." The words echoed, sealing her fate. The matriarch, bound by the very laws she upheld, had no choice. She slammed her ceremonial staff onto the marble floor. So be it. The sound was a death knell. Guards approached, but not for him. They moved to her. Her own attendants, their faces pale and eyes downcast, came forward with ceremonial tools. They began to unlatch her golden armor, piece by piece, leaving her exposed in the simple undertunic. It was a ritual of stripping, of removing not just her protection but her status, her very identity as a warrior. Jaira did not resist. She kept her back ramrod straight, her expression a mask of ice, even as her world crumbled around her. They led her from the arena, past the jeering, disgusted crowds, towards the victor's chambers that would now be her prison. Her gaze met Jesse's one last time, and in her piercing yellow eyes, he saw not gratitude, but a promise of pure, undiluted hatred. The chambers assigned to the victor were opulent, a stark contrast to the sterile cell Jesse had occupied for weeks. Intricate carvings spiraled up the stone walls, and silken fabrics in deep blues and purples draped over furniture carved from polished dark wood. It was a room fit for a king, and now it was his cage and hers. Jaira stood in the center of the room, her posture as rigid and unyielding as the statues that lined the corridor outside. The simple gray tunic she now wore did nothing to soften her formidable presence. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her yellow eyes tracked his every movement with a predator's intensity. The air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on him. 2 guards stood outside the heavy sealed door. They were alone. He had not wanted this. He had seen the political machinations from the moment she challenged him. He had seen the smug look on the face of the other high-born warrior on the dais. Killing her would have made him a monster in his own eyes and ignited a diplomatic firestorm. But this felt crueler. He was no conqueror. He was a survivor. "This is not what I wanted," he said, his voice quiet in the vast room. Her laugh was a sharp, brittle sound. "Did you think your mercy would earn you gratitude, human?" She spat the word human as if it were a curse. "You have taken everything from me. My honor, my house, my name. Death would have been a clean ending. You have given me a life of unending shame." He had no answer for that. The customs of her people were as alien to him as the twin suns in the sky. He only knew that the woman standing before him was a vortex of fury and pain. The law was clear. The servitude was absolute. It dictated that she would attend to his every need, including the most intimate. It was a power he never sought, a weapon of humiliation he was now expected to wield. As night fell outside, casting long, deep shadows across the chamber, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The law had to be fulfilled. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding a heavy, reluctant rhythm against his ribs. She did not move, her chin held high in an act of supreme defiance. Her scent, something sharp and wild like desert blooms after a storm, filled his senses. He reached for her, his hands hesitating for a moment before they touched the bare skin of her arms. Her blue skin was cool, and a tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through her at his touch. She flinched but did not pull away. This was her final battlefield, a war to be fought in stillness and silence. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. He drew her closer, his own body tense with a mixture of apprehension and a primal, unwanted stirring of desire. This was not about passion. It was a transaction of power, a mandate of a brutal law. Their first intimate encounter was a collision of worlds, a harsh, silent clash. It was a physical act born of legal obligation, a raw, graceless joining that was as much a struggle for dominance as it was for submission. There was no tenderness, only the cold, hard reality of their situation. In the aftermath, they lay apart on the vast silken bed, the silence between them a chasm of unspoken hostility. He had not been the monster she expected, but he had been the instrument of her shame. And in the darkness, surrounded by the alien splendor of his prison, Jessie felt more like a captive than ever before. The days that followed fell into a strange, tense rhythm. By day, Jura was a silent, efficient servant, attending to his needs with a cold precision that was in itself an act of defiance. She would bring him his meals, her face a mask of indifference. She would stand guard within the chambers, a statue of contemptuous obedience. But by night, the unspoken law demanded they share a bed, and the cold war between them would ignite into a physical, silent struggle. Each encounter was a battle, yet the nature of that battle was slowly, imperceptibly changing. He refused to treat her as a spoil of war, and his restraint was a constant source of confusion for her. Her people valued overwhelming force. This human strength was in his control, and it was a language she was slowly, reluctantly beginning to understand. One night, after a particularly strained and silent coupling, as they lay apart in the darkness, he spoke. "I know you hate me," he said, his voice a low murmur, "but it was your rival, Vorlog. He set you up." Zyra stiffened, turning her head to stare at him through the gloom. "Do not presume to understand the honor of the Xylos human." "I understand ambition," Jessie countered. "I saw his face when you challenged me. I saw it again when I defeated you. He didn't want you dead. He wanted you broken." She remained silent, but he could feel the shift in the air, the crack in her icy composure. The seed of doubt had been planted. The next day, her chief attendant, a young woman from a vassal house, came with a fresh change of linens. Her hands trembled as she worked, and she avoided Zyra's gaze. Later, as Zyra was clearing away Jessie's midday meal, the attendant returned, ostensibly to collect the tray. Underneath a napkin, there was a data chip. Zyra's fingers closed around it, her heart beginning to pound with a new, unfamiliar emotion, fear. Later that night, long after the guards had changed and the palace had settled, she accessed the chip using a small hidden reader in a piece of her personal jewelry she'd been allowed to keep. The chip contained encrypted communications, logs of shipments, a report from a Xylos intelligence agent detailing a captured human soldier with an unusually high combat adaptability rating. All of the information had been routed through Vorlag's personal channels and delivered to his aides a week before her challenge. The final file was a tactical analysis, predicting that a formal, honor-bound Xylos fighter would have a significant chance of being defeated by this specific human's unorthodox methods. The truth was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. Jessie was right. This had all been a setup. Vorlag hadn't just allowed her to fall. He had pushed her. He had used a human as a weapon to destroy her honor and clear his path to power. The man in her bed was not her conqueror. He was just another pawn in a Xylos game, the same as her. Her world tilted on its axis, every certainty she had ever known shattering into a million pieces. The revelation turned her world inside out. For her entire life, she had believed in the sanctity of Xylos honor, in the transparent righteousness of their traditions. Now, she saw it for what it was. A tool, a weapon that could be twisted by the ambitious and the corrupt. Vorlag, a man who draped himself in the rhetoric of tradition, had used the most dishonorable of means to orchestrate her downfall. And the human, the barbarian she had despised, had not only spared her life, but had also seen the truth she had been blind to. That night, she did not wait for him to approach her. She went to him. He was standing by the large window, looking out at the alien cityscape, a silhouette against the glow of the twin moons. "You were right," she said, her voice stripped of its usual hostility. He turned, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Vorlag, he knew you would win. He planned my disgrace." Jessie nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Zyra." It was the first time he had used her name, and the sound of it on his tongue was strangely intimate. For the first time, she looked at him not as her conqueror or her shame, but as the only person in the entire palace she could trust. Her enemy was not the man who shared her bed, but the man who would see them both dead to secure his power. "I need your help," she said, the words costing her a lifetime of pride. "My honor is in tatters. My house will soon disown me. Vorlog will not stop until I am eliminated, and as the instrument of my fall, you are a loose end he will not tolerate." "What do you propose?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "An alliance," she breathed. "I know Xylo's strategy. I know our politics, our weaknesses, but you think in ways we do not. You see angles we are blind to. Teach me." He was silent for a long moment, studying her. He saw the desperation in her fierce yellow eyes, but also a flicker of something new, a warrior's resolve, reforged and redirected. "All right," he said, "but it has to be on my terms. We do this my way." She gave a single, sharp nod. The truce was struck. From that moment on, everything changed. Their confinement was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. The bedchamber became a war room. The long nights, once a source of tension and shame, were now filled with whispered conversations. She laid out the intricate web of Xylos politics, the allegiances and rivalries between the great houses. He, in turn, began to break down the pillars of her martial training, teaching her the human concepts of asymmetric warfare, of deception, of using psychology as a weapon. It was anathema to everything she had ever been taught. But she was a desperate and brilliant student. Their forced intimacy became a strange, necessary cover, a place where they could speak freely, their bodies close, their minds working as one. Their chamber became a secret crucible. By day, Jaira maintained the facade of the broken servant, her movements quiet and subdued, her eyes downcast whenever the guards were near. But when they were alone, the chamber transformed. The plush carpets became a training mat. Jesse pushed her relentlessly, forcing her to unlearn the beautiful, rigid, and ultimately predictable forms of Xylos combat. He taught her to fight like a human, like a survivor. "Your forms are for duels of honor," he explained, easily sidestepping a powerful, sweeping strike from her practice staff. "They assume your opponent will meet you head-on. They are useless against an enemy who will not play by your rules." He showed her how to use feints, how to break rhythm, how to turn an opponent's strength and momentum into a weapon against them. He taught her to use the environment, to see a room not as empty space, but as a collection of potential weapons and obstacles. The training was brutal and intensely physical. Their bodies were in constant contact, grappling, sparring, demonstrating. A sparring session would often end with them breathless and tangled on the floor, the line between combat and caress blurring into something new and exhilarating. The scent of her skin, the heat of her body, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, it was becoming a potent distraction. In turn, Jaira became his tutor in the art of Xylos politics. She explained the subtle insults and power plays hidden within their formal language, the ancient debts and feuds that governed the actions of the great houses. "Honor is our currency," she told him one night, her voice a low murmur as they sat close on the edge of the bed, supposedly reviewing servant protocols. "Vorlog uses it to buy loyalty and to bankrupt his enemies. To defeat him, we must show that his honor is counterfeit." Their alliance, born of desperation, was solidifying into something deeper. They were partners. The forced intimacy of their servitude had, paradoxically, created a space of absolute trust. In that bed, they were stripped of pretense, their vulnerabilities laid bare. The act itself began to change. The silent battle of wills was replaced by a shared exploration, a tentative curiosity. He discovered the sensitive patterns of the fine, iridescent scales along her back and sides. She learned the language of his body, the way a slight tensing of his jaw betrayed his thoughts. The nights were no longer a legal mandate to be endured, but a willing discovery of each other, a fusion of mind and body that left them both breathless and bound in a way no law could ever command. Their shared danger and mutual respect were igniting a passion that was as fierce and undeniable as Jaira herself. Vorlag, sensing he had not completely broken Jira's spirit, tightened his grip. His campaign of whispers became a torrent of lies. He began to leak information to the public datanet, short, carefully selected audio and hollow recordings from the surveillance devices in Jira's chambers. The recordings were masterfully edited, showing moments of intimacy stripped of all context. A shared laugh was twisted into the sound of a woman enjoying her debasement. A moment of quiet conversation was presented as a conspiratorial whisper against her own people. Jesse's calm instructions during a training session were edited to sound like the commands of a master to his slave. The Xylos public, steeped in a culture of martial pride, was horrified. The story was simple and poisonous. The sword of House Kor had not only been defeated by a primitive human, but had been so thoroughly broken that she now willingly, even eagerly, submitted to her conqueror. Her name became a curse in the mouths of warriors, a cautionary tale for apprentices. The pressure on her house was immense. The council, fearing disgrace by association, began formal proceedings to disown her, to strike her name from their lineage. Fanatical warrior sects, fueled by Vorlog's rhetoric, openly called for the execution of both the tainted warrior and the alien who had defiled her. The walls of their opulent prison were closing in. Guards outside the door now watched them with open contempt. Their food was sometimes cold, their requests for fresh linens ignored. They were pariahs, isolated in a gilded cage. But instead of breaking them apart, the pressure fused them together. The danger outside made the sanctuary of their chambers, and of each other, absolute. The nights became their only time of peace, a defiant refuge. "They cannot see past their own pride," Jesse said one night, his hand tracing the line of her sharp, pointed ear as she lay beside him. "Their honor is a cage, and Vorlog holds the key." "Then we must build our own key," Jaira replied, her voice low and fierce. Her hand found his, her fingers lacing through his. It was the first time she had initiated such a simple, tender touch. It was not born of law or necessity, but of a shared and desperate purpose. "The cage he built for me will become his tomb." The fear she felt was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a white-hot rage and by the steady, reassuring presence of the man beside her. They were no longer victor and vanquished. They were survivors. And in the heart of their shared peril, the last vestiges of their initial hostility burned away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their bond. Jaira, armed with Jesse's lessons in human subterfuge, began to weave her own web. She knew Vorlog's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He believed her to be broken, a pawn in his game. He would never suspect she was capable of playing the game herself. Her first move was to use her chief attendant to pass a message to one of Vorlog's less intelligent agents, a warrior known for his greed. The message was a carefully crafted piece of misinformation, hinting that Jesse was in secret communication with the human ambassador and was planning to trade Jaira for valuable concessions. It was designed to make Vorlog paranoid, to make him believe Jesse was more than just a simple soldier. Next, she and Jesse staged their performance. One afternoon, during a shift change of the guards, they erupted into a loud, vicious argument. Jaira screamed insults at him in the Xylos tongue, accusing him of being a dishonorable beast. Jesse roared back in his own language, throwing a piece of ornate furniture against the wall. The crash echoed through the corridor. The guards, peering through the door's grill, saw a scene of chaos. The submissive slave apparently rebelling, the human conqueror asserting his dominance. They reported back to Vorlog exactly what they were meant to see. The alliance, if there ever was one, was shattered. The ruse worked perfectly. With Vorlog's surveillance now focused on Jesse's supposed contact with the outside world, Jaira used the brief windows of distraction to communicate with the few allies she had left, members of vassal houses who were more afraid of Vorlog's tyranny than her dishonor. She didn't ask for their loyalty. She appealed to their self-interest, showing them how Vorlog's consolidation of power would ultimately diminish their own. The plan was a delicate, dangerous dance of misdirection and calculated risk. The final piece was the most audacious. Once her allies were in position and Vorlog was sufficiently distracted, Jaira sent a formal petition to the High Council. Citing Vorlog's slander against her house and his unbecoming ambition, she challenged him to a grievance duel. Not to the death, but for the leadership of House Kor. The move was unprecedented, a disgraced, disowned warrior challenging the most powerful traditionalist on the council. It was an act of supreme desperation, and the council, bound by the very honor codes Vorlog championed, had no choice but to grant it. The day of the duel was cold, the light of the twin suns casting long, sharp shadows across the white sands of the grand arena. This time, the crowd was not roaring for blood. They were murmuring in tense, shocked anticipation. Jaira stood not in the golden armor of her house, but in a simple, unadorned leather harness. She carried no plasma glaive, only a pair of balanced, unpowered blades, the traditional weapons of a duelist with nothing left to lose. Across from her, Vorlag was a mountain of polished dark blue armor, his own glaive humming with lethal energy. He looked at her with contemptuous pity. This would be a swift, brutal execution, a final confirmation of his power. The matriarch gave the signal, and Vorlag charged, expecting to overwhelm her with a single powerful strike. But the Zaira he faced was not the same warrior she had been weeks ago. She did not meet his charge. She sidestepped, her movement fluid and economical, a perfect execution of Jesse's teachings. She let his momentum carry him past her, and as he turned, his powerful but predictable movements left him momentarily exposed. She didn't attack. She simply used the opening to create more distance, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his rising frustration. The duel became a masterful display of strategy over strength. Zira refused to engage him on his terms. She was a ghost on the sand, evading, parrying, using his own aggressive lunges to tire him out. She used the arena itself, the shifting sands, the glare of the suns, as her allies. She taunted him, not with insults, but with his own words, her voice amplified for the whole council to hear. "Is this the honorable strength of a true Xylos, Vorlag, or the blind fury of a man who fears the truth?" she called out, easily dodging another clumsy, enraged swing. He roared and charged again, abandoning all form, his pride shattered. It was the mistake she had been waiting for. As he lunged, she dropped low, her blade sweeping out not to cut, but to hook the joint behind his knee. His leg buckled. In the same fluid motion, she rose, using his forward momentum to spin him around, disarming him with a precise strike to his wrist that sent his glaive flying. Before he could recover, she had a blade pressed to his throat, just as Jesse had done to her. The arena was silent. But this time, the silence was one of awe. She leaned in close, her voice a low, deadly whisper only he could hear. "Yield, or I will show you what true dishonor feels like." Then, raising her voice for the council, she called out, "Tell them, Vorlag. Tell them how you plotted to disgrace my house. Tell them of the agent's report you buried." His eyes widened in terror and disbelief. Checkmate. In front of the entire Xylos leadership, broken and defeated, he confessed everything. Jira's victory was not just a personal triumph. It was a seismic shift in the foundations of Xylos society. She stood before the High Council, not as the shamed woman from weeks before, but as a revolutionary leader. Vorlag was exiled, his name stricken from the records, a fate worse than death in their culture. Jira, reinstated as the head of House Kor, used her newfound authority to call for immediate reform. Her first act was to challenge the archaic law of conquest. "Honor is not found in the breaking of a defeated foe," she declared, her voice ringing with a power no one had ever heard from her before. "It is found in the wisdom to know when a life is more valuable than a victory." Jesse was brought before her in the council. The chains were gone. He stood as a free man. Jaira looked at him, and for a moment they were not leader and soldier, but simply a man and a woman who had survived a crucible together. "By the authority of House Kor," she announced formally, "the conqueror's servitude of the human, Jesse, is ended. He is granted his freedom and is hereby named honored strategist to our house, a friend to the Xylos people." A murmur of approval, of understanding, rippled through the council. A new era had begun. Later that night, the opulent chambers were no longer a prison. They were her own. The silks and polished woods seemed warmer, the air lighter. Jesse was preparing to leave, gathering the few belongings he had. Zaira entered, closing the heavy door behind her. She had shed her formal robes and wore a simple, soft tunic. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the silence between them no longer a chasm of hostility, but a space filled with 1,000 unspoken things. "You are free to go," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his voice equally quiet. He made no move towards the door. She crossed the room and stood before him, the top of her head barely reaching his chin. The power dynamic that had defined their every interaction was gone, replaced by a raw, uncertain equality. She reached up, her hand gently touching his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. The law no longer binds me to you, Jesse. Her yellow eyes held his, fierce and vulnerable. But I am not yet ready for you to leave. He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and solid. I'm not ready to go, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He lowered his head and their lips met. It was not a clash of wills or a mandate of law. It was a slow, deep, and profound kiss of two equals, two survivors, two lovers. It was a kiss that tasted of freedom and a future they would now choose and build together. A new law had been written, not in the ancient texts, but in the depths of their own hearts.